Hi, my name is Insia, and I'm a tutor at San Jose State University's Writing Center. Today, we're going to be talking about offensive stereotypes about Indigenous peoples and important considerations to make when writing about them creatively, professionally, or in an academic setting. It's important for us to acknowledge the diversity of Indigenous peoples' cultures, traditions, and languages throughout the Western Hemisphere. When writing about a particular tribe or nation, learning and using accurate terms can prevent stereotypes and encourage cultural understanding and sensitivity. For this video, you will not require any additional materials. Okay, let's get started. Let's start by defining the term Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples are distinct social and cultural groups that share collective ancestral ties to the lands and natural resources where they live, occupy, or from which they have been displaced. The next term we want to define is stereotype. So what exactly is a stereotype? Well, it's a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person or thing. So why exactly are stereotypes in writing harmful? Firstly, they perpetuate negative generalizations, parodies, and misconceptions about entire groups of people. Secondly, writing and literature containing harmful stereotypes can have real-world impacts. It can influence readers and leave them with inaccurate impressions of diverse cultures, groups, and identities. But most importantly, they can cause unintentional harm. Writers do not intend to offend, however, the inclusion of diverse identities in writing is a sensitive matter that needs to be handled carefully. This can be done by making ourselves more aware of existing stereotypes and doing thorough research before introducing characters into our creative, academic, and professional writing. When describing Indigenous communities, it is important to remember that Native peoples often have individual preferences about how they would like to be addressed. For example, there are several terms used to refer to Native peoples in the Western Hemisphere. The Inuit, Yupik, and Aleut peoples in the Arctic see themselves as culturally separate from Native Americans. So when writing about Native groups or people, use the terminology that the members of the community use to describe themselves collectively. Similarly, Native Americans describe their own cultures and the places they come from in many different ways. The words tribe and nation are used interchangeably, but holds very different meanings for many Native people. Tribes often have more than one name because when the Europeans arrived in the Americas, they used inaccurate pronunciations of the tribal names or renamed the tribes with European names. Many tribal groups are known officially by names that include their nation. Every community has a distinct perspective on how they describe themselves, and it is important to remember the best term to use is always what a person or tribal community uses to describe themselves. Let's talk about some of these offensive terms and negative associations. Historically and today, representations of Native Americans, specifically Native American men, have frequently relied on stereotypes of violence, barbarism, and savagery. It is important, therefore, to understand the history behind these negative associations. Violent stereotypes were originally used by settlers and colonizers to justify their own violent efforts to subdue Native Americans. If Native Americans were seen as a threat, it became not only acceptable, but necessary to protect other settlers from their violent nature. The negative association between Native Americans and violence has been a very damaging one in American culture, which has affected all Native American communities. It is therefore our responsibility as writers to better understand the background of these stereotypes and make an effort to not reinforce them in our creative, academic, and professional writing, as well as when researching. So what should we do when we're doubtful? All this information may be a bit overwhelming. However, by asking questions and doing your research, you will be better equipped to handle the situation when it arises. If you've decided to include Indigenous identities in your writing, then treat them with care and consideration. It is important to remember that language changes and evolves. It's not static. So terminology that was accepted 20 years ago might not be now. So always remember to do your research and ask questions when in doubt. Next, let's talk about Western literature and how it often reduces Indigenous intellect and practices by labeling them as primitive and uncivilized. First, however, let's go through some definitions. The first term we're going to define is ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is unthinkingly putting one's own culture at the center of one's thinking. judging other cultures by how closely they resemble one's own. So, for example, if it's normal in a culture to use utensils to consume food, they may deem the eating of food with hands as uncivilized behavior. That is an ethnocentric view on modes of consumption in different cultures. The second term we'll define is primitive. Primitive means relating to, denoting, or preserving the character of an early stage in the evolutionary or historical development of something. To put it in simpler words, it's when someone or something is deemed as less advanced. The third and last term we're going to define is civilized, which means to be more advanced socially and culturally. Now that we know all these terms, let's learn about the civilized versus primitive stereotype. Historically, Indigenous people have been considered lesser as their religious practices and ways of life have been different than that of settlers. Whereas settlers with seemingly more organized forms of religion and cultural practices were considered better than the Indigenous peoples, as their practices were seen as more civilized. However, it is our responsibility as writers to identify ethnocentrism within literature and our writing when writing about Indigenous culture. We have to actively participate in understanding Indigenous culture through reliable, holistic, and credible scholarly resources if we choose to include it in our creative, professional, or academic writing. As we move towards the end of this video, it is important to acknowledge a trope that shares a relationship with Indigenous stereotypes and is equally as harmful, if not more: the white savior narrative. In the context of this conversation, the white savior narrative outwardly appears to be about the accomplishments of a Black, Indigenous, person of color, BIPOC character, yet features a white person as an integral part of this person's success. What makes this narrative so damaging is that it implicitly tells audiences that Indigenous individuals, in our case, rather than standing up for themselves, require benevolent white people to rescue them. Moreover, issues of prejudice and inequality are often downplayed and solved by the end of the book or movie in which the white savior narrative occurs in. What this does is, it downplays the devastating impact of systemic racism by presenting audiences with a neat and easy solution, wherein the white person saves the day at the end of the story. If today's topic interested you and you would like to further your knowledge on Indigenous peoples and communities, here are some books you may want to check out: From the Ashes, Dear White Peacemakers, and The Truth About Stories. Be sure to check them out. Today we learned about common Indigenous stereotypes so we can work to actively avoid using them in our academic and creative writing. Remember, when in doubt about something, ask rather than just assume. Thank you for watching. I hope this video on offensive stereotypes about Indigenous peoples was helpful and educational. For more information, you can visit the SJSU Writing Center's website, blog, and social media accounts. Good luck and have an amazing rest of your day.